Welcome, everyone, to the first panel of the Carnegie Global Dialogue Series for 2022-2023. My name is Paul Haenle, and I'm the director of Carnegie China, and I'm glad to be joined today by my colleagues and good friends, Da Wei, Ian Chong, and Yun Sun, to discuss the future of U.S. China relations in the aftermath of a couple political events, one in China and one in the U.S., where we had in China the 20th Party Congress, and in the U.S. Just yesterday had the U.S. midterm elections. For those of you who are familiar with or unfamiliar, I should say, with our Carnegie Global Dialogue Series, this is our 11th year of hosting this series, and it's a series of panel discussions that takes a look at China's evolving foreign policy and international role from the perspective of Carnegie scholars and international experts at each of our global centers across the globe. You'll be able to find replays, if you're interested, of this dialogue and actually all the previous dialogues within our Carnegie Global Dialogue Series on Carnegie China's China in the World podcast. Today, let me turn and introduce each of our experts. Here with me, I'll start with the scholar that's closest to me physically, and that's Ian Chong, who's with me here in Singapore. We're both based in Singapore now. Ian is a non-resident scholar now at Carnegie China. He's an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. His research covers the intersection of international and domestic politics. He has a focus on major power competition and security in Northeast and Southeast Asia, as well as cross-strait relations. As I mentioned, he's now a non-resident scholar at Carnegie China, which we're delighted about. And with Carnegie China, he'll be looking closely at U.S. China dynamics in Southeast Asia and the broader Asia Pacific. From the U.S., we have Yun Sun, senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. I know our audience is familiar with Yun Sun. She's an experienced scholar and analyst on U.S.-China relations, China's foreign policy. Previous to the Stimson Center, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Chinese national security, decision-making processes, and China-Africa relations. And prior to Brookings, Yun Sun was a China analyst at the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, from Beijing, China, this evening, Asia time, we have with us Professor Da Wei, who is the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, also a professor of international relations at the School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University. And we're fortunate to have had Da Wei join us several times in the past, including for our Carnegie Global Dialogue. In fact, I think Da Wei probably attended one of our first Global Dialogue roundtables back in 2011. My staff tells me that you've got that much history with Carnegie China. So we appreciate you joining us again. Prior to Tsinghua, Da Wei was assistant president of the University of International Relations. Previous to that, he was director of the Institute of American Studies at the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. So thank you all for joining us. Before we kick off the discussion, let me just say first, we want to give the audience an opportunity tonight to ask questions. If you'd like to submit a question, you can use the chat function on YouTube. Secondly, we'll post a recording of this discussion on the China in the World podcast, where you'll be able to find it afterwards. Okay, in the past couple months, we've witnessed now, as I mentioned up front, two major political events that have the potential to shape the trajectory of U.S.-China relations going forward for the next year, if not next several years to come. Namely, the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which took place in October in Beijing, and then yesterday in the United States, the midterm elections. In Beijing, the 20th Party Congress, which is held every 5 years, I think you can say it was a watershed event in Chinese politics. I think it's fair to say that. Xi Jinping secured an unprecedented third term as General Secretary and made major changes in personnel in the Central Committee, in the Politburo, and in the Politburo Standing Committee. And the Standing Committee is now filled with loyalists and proteges of President Xi. There doesn't appear to be any balancing of power with other factions or interest groups as we've seen in the past. We also saw some previous norms in terms of age limits and clearly a movement further away from collective leadership. So, quite a few changes I think that we saw, and we can talk about some of those tonight. I will say economic development was mentioned as an ongoing priority in the work report and also in President Xi's speech. But there's quite a bit of debate out there about, how high of a priority it will be or what the balance will be with other priorities that were highlighted, including, for example, national security, social stability, and ideology. And it seems quite clear that national security is poised to play a much larger role in the leadership's priorities going forward. Now, in terms of the U.S. midterms, we're still watching the results come in, but some things are clear. There are millions of votes yet to be counted, I should say, as we're live tonight. But early estimates suggest that the Republican Party is on course to win back control of the U.S. House of Representatives, first time in 4 years. The Senate, however, remains too close to call. There are 35 seats up for election this year in the Senate, which has obviously 100 seats, but there's only a handful of closely contested races. And a net change of 1 seat toward the Republicans would give them control because the Senate sat at 50-50. Right now, we're waiting on results from Senate races in Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Georgia, which looks like it'll go to a runoff election in December. And until those races are decided, we won't know what happens with the Senate. But the Democrats have had unified control of Congress for 2 years. And with the Republicans certainly going to take the House, no matter what happens in the Senate, the power dynamic is bound to shift. That we can expect. So tonight, I look forward to discussing the impact of these two political events, one in China, one in the U.S., on the trajectory of U.S. China relations. We can also discuss key issues in the relationship, Taiwan, growing technology cooperation that we're seeing play out. And lastly, there's a real possibility, although it has not been announced officially, of an in-person meeting between President Biden and President Xi next week on the margins of the G20 in Bali, Indonesia, which will take place November 15th and 16th. So I look forward to discussing, the goals of such a meeting, what can be accomplished, if anything. And again, to address these questions, I'm really delighted to have 3 top U.S. China experts. So let's start out with the first question, and we'll start with U.S. midterms. Again, the votes have not all been finalized in all of the races, but it does look like the Republicans will take the House and the Senate could go either way. So I wanted to really just start out with each of you. I know it's early, and I don't expect that you'll have your analysis completely finalized here, but I wanted to just check to see what initial assessments or thoughts you might have on what the results, at least that we can tell to this point, what kind of impact they may have on U.S.-China relations, U.S. policy toward China going forward. And given the political event is in the United States, I'm going to start, I think, with Yunsun, who's closest to it. So over to you, Yunsun, for some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, we're all observing the midterm elections, and the media have been going frenzy about what that means for the U.S.-China relations. I think to begin with, if the Republicans do take the House, we know that the bipartisan consensus on China has been not only formed, but also solidified in the past 5 to 6 years. So to say that the Republicans will dramatically change the current discourse on China, therefore the U.S. policy direction, I think that's unrealistic. But Republicans may not make U.S.-China relationship to look in a positive trajectory, but the Republicans definitely will leave Biden less room on China. He will have less options. He will have less flexibility, especially on issues that he still seeks to strike a conciliatory tone with China or try to manage the tension. I think the Republicans will give Biden administration less options and less room on that specific issue. And we're also looking at special, what I call them special events or potential crisis, because if the Republicans do dominate the House, like on the top of a lot of people's mind is that if Republicans do win and Kevin McCarthy does become the Speaker of the House, then is he going to lead the largest ever congressional delegation to visit Taiwan after the inauguration of next year? We know that President Biden and his team had attempted to stop Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to visit Taiwan this past summer. So, and we can also foresee that now the 20th Party Congress is over in China, China's response to another visit to Taiwan by the U.S. Speaker of the House is not, well, it potentially could be much more escalatory than what we witnessed in August. So those events that are not under the White House control and potentially will be intensified under a Republican-led House of the Representatives are going to create more stress in the U.S. China relations, as we can foresee. Thank you.
Interesting. So no major policy direction changes because there is consensus, but yet it will probably give Biden less flexibility. And a Republican-controlled House may do things on China or Taiwan that maybe are not things that the executive branch is looking to do. Is what I hear you saying. Ian, let me turn to you if I could, because one of the changes that would take place in the House is that Republicans will take place of the oversight function and the power to investigate. And there's a lot of speculation that, over the last 2 years, the Democrats investigated the January 6th attack on Capitol Hill and had hearings on abortion and healthcare. These, their set of priorities. Republicans, clearly have a different set of priorities, whether, it includes, probably, looking at the border issues, or they may want to do some investigation on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. But one that comes up is Joe Biden's, President Biden's son, Hunter Biden's laptop. And of course, Hunter Biden scandal involves a piece about his ties to China. There's also speculation that there could be hearings where the Republicans invite U.S. CEOs to come and testify, asking questions about, their business in China. Are they helping prop up the Chinese Communist Party? Are they helping state-owned enterprises? Are they helping China advance its surveillance state, or help the Communist Party commit human rights violations? What's your sense on the kind of, if those kind of things take place, if we see more of that? Do you think, first of all, there's a chance of that? And second, how do you see the impact on the relationship itself?
So there are a couple of things I'd note. One is I agree that there will likely be a different set of investigations. The Hunter Biden one, I think, if it takes place, how much traction it gets, I think it's a slightly different issue. Republicans have been trying to make hay out of it, but on substantive issues, I'm not sure how much it actually affects the administration now, except politically. But I think the more interesting one, and probably the stickler, will be when if there are hearings on U.S. companies, U.S. CEOs. I think the one that actually looms large in my mind is Twitter, right? Because Elon Musk has, put out positions that seem very China friendly. Twitter is a very used platform by U.S. politicians and media. So I think that might come under some scrutiny. And how that plays out, I think could really send some ripples in the U.S. China relationship. I think the other thing that might come up is TikTok, right? Because there's been reports of TikTok sending personal information of its users to people in China. That's been, I mean, it's sort of come again and sort of gone again, but it's always sort of simmering under the surface. So I can see that come up. Those hearings, depending on what happens, has the potential to, I think, inflame a lot of feelings, which will further, I think, hem in what the Biden administration can do. That's on the sort of U.S. domestic front. I just like to add to that, if there is going to be more tension or distance between the U.S. and China on the technology, what might happen too is other countries in the region that are part of that whole supply chain and the sort of technology chain, places like Singapore, places like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, they will be under a lot more pressure, right? On which side they go, how they shield off different parts of their businesses. So I think the sort of business hearing bit potentially has some legs, and I personally watch that.
Very interesting. Dawei, over to you, and I'd really be interested, in your sense on how these midterms were perceived in Beijing, in China. And one aspect is obviously losing Congress could be seen as a sign of President Biden's political weakness. And I wonder whether Chinese leaders might be less inclined to work with him. Will they sit back and wait for a new administration in 2024? What's your thoughts on that?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Paul, for having me and talking with two old friends on this issue. I think from Beijing's perspective, generally speaking, we follow that election, and I think the mainstream view here is no matter who control the House and the Senate, the policy, just like what Sun Yun said, won't change a lot. But of course, probably could be bad, could be worse. But generally speaking, the whole direction will be the same. Well, if the Republican control the two houses, I think Biden will become, so-called lame duck president. But I don't think Beijing, even if that happened, I don't think Beijing will sit there and wait for a new president, because it's too dangerous. There are still two years for this term of President Biden, and 2 years is quite a long time. We cannot squander the 2 years, and even beyond this term, we don't know who win the election, who will be president after 2024, and again, it could be worse. So I think it will be wise to utilize next 2 years to try to stabilize the bilateral relations with the United States. But of course, if the Republican control the legislative branch, it could be difficult. Could be difficult. But I don't see, and I have not seen or heard anybody talking about let's wait for the next president, and Biden is too weak. I don't think it's a mainstream view here, but people do have concern that Republicans may cause more trouble in the Congress.
Yeah, I think even if the Dems do manage to maintain control of the Senate, with a divided government, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for Biden and the Democrats to pass any legislation. And even if the Republicans take the Senate, there's a lot that the Democrats can do in terms of blocking using the filibuster rule. Significant legislation needs 60 votes. So I think, for the next 2 years, we may have some legislative gridlock ahead of us, sort of be the name of the game in my mind. Let's switch to the 20th Party Congress. And, I mentioned, some perspectives in terms of Xi's enhanced focus on national security. I didn't mention, but I'll mention now, technological self-sufficiency was another theme that came out pretty strong. Strengthening socialist ideology and party unity. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're struck by the President Xi's move to basically put all his proteges in the top positions in the Politburo Standing Committee. Let me start, if I could, in reverse order with Dawei. I'd start by just sort of what's your assessment, and what do you believe observers outside of China may not have gotten right on the 20th Party Congress outcomes? And then, of course, what's your sense of what it means for foreign policy and U.S. China relations going forward?
Yes, I think probably the observers outside China may neglect the continuity in the 20th Party Congress working report comparing with the previous one, the one from 5 years ago. Like you mentioned, the paragraph, the chapter on the national security issues that being raised a lot, discussed a lot outside China, of course, inside China too. But what I want to emphasize is actually President Xi raised the concept of the holistic national security view in 2014, I think that's already 8 years ago. And actually all the content in that chapter, the chapter on national security, I think are not new. So basically he repeated what he said in past 8 years. The difference here is there's no individual chapter in previous 19th Party Congress and 18th Party Congress. And this time it's an individual separate chapter. But the problem is in the previous one, they put the national security issue under social security. I think that's not normal. I think that's wrong. I think national security issue for every country is an important issue. So it should be, it should have a separate chapter. So I think it's just back to a normal status. So we should not emphasize the importance of that. But of course, comparing with 10 years ago, that's a big change. Comparing with 10 years ago, but if we compare that to 5 years ago, I think it's not new. And another point I want to add is like a lot of people talk about the change of the so-called the main theme or the main topic 时代主题 of this era, the peace and development. It disappeared from the 20th Party Congress working report. Yeah, that's of course that's a change. But I want to add two things. One is though the old main theme, peace and development, is not in the working report, but there's no replacement here. It means that maybe this issue, maybe the party want to use different paradigm. I mean, just try to avoid discussing what is the main theme. Or another explanation is too important. It's still under discussion. So anyway, I mean, it's if the party replace peace and development with, for instance, war and revolution, that will be a dramatic change. But no, there's no replacement, right? So and the policies in that working paper foreign policies basically are not new. I don't see many changes in the policy description part. So yeah, there are a lot of changes, particularly the assessment of the external environment. But I want to emphasize here is the continuity. We should not neglect this continuity in the report.
And you mean on the continuity, you also mean with regard to foreign policy direction and U.S. China?
I mean, generally speaking, I mean the foreign policy and the foreign policy and also one country, two systems, the military building. I think those national security related issue, I don't see dramatic or important changes in the policy part.
Thank you, Dawei. Yun-Sun, you're based in DC and interact with a lot of Americans. I'd be interested to know, how do you think it was received there? Was continuity kind of the major theme that was taken away? Or did it reinforce, sort of people's worst fears about the direction that China is moving? And, what's your sense of how that will impact U.S. China going forward?
Thank you, Paul. You really raised the key question, and I think the distinction or the differences between the Chinese interpretation and the American interpretation of what happened at the 20th Party Congress cannot be more significant. I think when the report of the 20th Party Congress was first released, I hear that the media and observers across the board are saying, well, continuity is a key word, because you read through the 20th Party Congress report. I think the comment was, you can pretty much identify every single sentence in an already released government statement or government policy in the past 2 years. So I think that is very true. If you look at the new concept that has been raised, it's really not that striking. But then I think Dawei also raised a terrific point that what is the reference point here? That if you compare things to what happened in the past 2 years, maybe there is a strong sense of continuity. But if you compare it to, for example, the report from the 19th Party Congress, then I would say that the distinction or the differences are really striking on the issue of Hong Kong, on the issue of one country, two systems, on the issue of Taiwan, as well as on the issue of basically the external environment that China faces. Other than the peace and development as the two main themes of the era has disappeared from the report, I think another key word that people have paid a lot of attention to is whether China still refers to the window of strategic opportunity is still open. And we have seen this repeatedly in the previous Party Congress reports, but this time that term has also been removed. But so overall, I think it reflects a judgment or an assessment that for China, the sense of crisis, sense of insecurity, sense of external threat, and also the word, the struggle that has been used quite frequently in the Party Congress report. I think that those senses have been heightened to an unprecedented level. At least people have not seen those that high level of reference in recent decades. And then, of course, in after the Party Congress, we also have seen things in China that arguably represent tighter domestic control. And one example that people frequently talk about is the re-emergence of the supply and the marketing cooperative, 供销社. And people have to wonder, what does that mean? What does that mean for the Chinese economy? And what does that mean for the China's relationship with the external world? And I'm afraid that from at least a foreign perspective, things are not going into a more open, more liberal, and a more accommodating and tolerant direction. Instead, what people do see is a tightening of the environment. But of course, one disclaimer is that because of COVID quarantine and the restrictions, most of the Westerners, especially interlocutors and think tank scholars, have not been able to go to China for almost 3 years now. So that segregation or the separation, physical inability to have meeting and to see what's going on, have contributed significantly to this perception, because people don't know what is really going on. We can only read from the government documents and read what's being posted on the media. And so far, the preliminary assessment is that things are not going into a more liberal direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Ian, you've heard, Dawei's interpretation there in Beijing, and Yun-Sun, who's in Washington, D.C. Help us understand it from Southeast Asia's perspective, or here in Singapore, and how is it different? How is the assessment of the 20th Party Congress outcomes different from what we've heard from Dawei or Yun-Sun? And in terms of U.S. China, is your sense that it'll stay the same, it'll get better, get worse over time?
So I think a lot of the reading that I see in our part of the world, it's a bit different from what you see in DC and what you see in Beijing. There is certainly a lot of attention to the increased talk about struggle that Sun Yun had mentioned. There is people have taken notice of the emphasis on security. So while I agree with Dawei, the difference over the past 2 to 5 year period hasn't been that great. But for actors in this region who aren't sort of the major great powers of the world and are therefore a lot more anxious, the view is that China has been pretty tough over the past 5 years, and increasingly so. That trajectory seems likely to continue. There is concern over the sort of internal sort of focus on technology and trade, because as you know, many countries in Southeast Asia do look at China as a big trading partner. So there's a lot more trepidation about where things could go. And I think one of the noticeable things from Southeast Asia is that there's a lot of quiet, and that silence, relative silence, I think, is reflective of a degree of uncertainty. There's a concern that if you say things that Beijing does not like, it would get upset. It seems to have this habit of becoming upset on many things very frequently. At least that's the read here. And on the other is, well, they don't go. There's no sort of sense of what to make of it. So do you sort of back off more? Do you try to assert yourself, your own voice a little bit more? And the sort of holding pattern that you've seen for a while is this not choosing sides business, which is, if you think about just the very wording, we do not wish to choose sides, it's a very passive policy, right? You essentially have ceded initiative, and you're trying not to make any decision. In that regard, I think it's reflective of this sort of worry that on the Beijing side, things will get tougher. And as we talked about on the Washington side, things don't look any easier. So there's a lot of effort to hide, I would say, and not really a clear idea of what to do, right? If there is more of a decoupling, if you will, between Beijing and Washington. If you think about Southeast Asia and Singapore in particular, we've really benefited, right, from being able to work with both sides and sort of benefit from that. So if there's more distance, there's more tension, the strategy for it isn't as clear. So as a friend of mine describes, right, going to Mandarin a little bit, it's the region has really tried to make use of its relationship with both sides, but you could end up in a situation where you end up offending both sides. So 希望就是两边通吃，结果变成两边都不是人, right? So there's that real fear of that being squeezed in the middle, and there's no real idea what to do about it.
Fascinating. It's a fascinating description, Ian, and I appreciate those insights. We should move to Taiwan, because that's an issue, obviously, that affects not just U.S. and China, but what I hear from friends and scholars and experts here in Singapore, is a real concern if tensions get much higher, or worse yet, even conflict, that it'll have major repercussions here as well. And we've seen the tension growing on this issue, certainly after the visit of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Chinese reaction, the military reaction, large-scale live-fire military exercises around Taiwan, and a persistent now and consistent presence, PLA presence around Taiwan. So a bit of a change in the military status quo. That said, the 20th Party Congress Work Report reiterated China's longstanding position that it wants to solve the issue peacefully, but again, doesn't renounce the use of force if necessary. There was, however, it seemed, much more emphasis on its opposition to foreign interference. And that's obviously not new. That's always been China's position, but it seemed louder this time. It seemed more pronounced this time. And I suspect that has to do with the United States. But I also suspect that has to do with a worry that after Ukraine, much of the world now is wondering what will happen with Taiwan, and there's greater international attention. Now, in the U.S., we heard Yoon Sun say that, with a Republican Congress, there could be quite a bit of provocations on Taiwan, or at least provocations seen from Beijing's side. Maybe Kevin McCarthy, as the new House Speaker, may travel to Taiwan. They may push on particular issues within Congress, may push for a more provocative, more robust Taiwan Policy Act. So where does this all go? And are we headed, towards much greater friction, or worse yet, conflict? And what can we do to better manage the situation? And I think I'll start with my friend in Beijing, Da Wei, to share with us, his insights. What can we do to reduce risks, avoid worst case outcomes?
I'm quite pessimistic towards Taiwan issue. I think we are in a dilemma, or we are in a reinforced dilemma. And I think I have to criticize some American pundits, though I'm really reluctant to do that. But I mean, viewing Taiwan question from Ukraine lens, I think it's wrong. History does not repeat itself. It only rhymes. So I think that's a totally different issue, but to link them together, and I think Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, to be honest, it was a mistake, and the executive branch did not like that. I think that's true. So today, but it looks like everybody, particularly analysts outside China, just criticize China for overreaction. I think first that's an unnecessary provocation from the U.S. side, and if you do that, I mean, if American side do that, China have to do something, and that worries me for next year, as Sun Yun pointed out earlier. I think the next the speaker could be Kevin McCarthy. Already said he will visit Taiwan and will lead a very big delegation. If so, how could we expect Beijing to have different reaction? I think it's really hard for Beijing to do something different from August. And again, this is unnecessary. I think if Nancy Pelosi's visit was not necessary, I don't think Speaker McCarthy's visit is in anybody's interest. But I think if he want to do that, I think Beijing really have no other choice but to at least react at the level like last August. So I think that really disappointing me. I think in the US, a lot of wrong analysts analysis, like a lot of people talking about 2027 timetable. There's no timetable. I live in Beijing. I've never heard of timetable. I don't know why so many people talk about timetable. And before the Party Congress, so many American colleagues told me that Beijing will have new discourse in the Party Congress. Hey, those pundits should step out and give me an apology. There's no new discourse. And they told me that China will revise its anti-secession law next spring. Let's wait and see if that will happen. I mean, so many wrong analysis in DC. I think I really worry about that. I think we have to. I think we really need to change that. But probably the starting point is the U.S. side should not give us unnecessary provocation. Yes.
Thank you, Dawei. Yunsun, I want to turn to you. Dawei's raised some important points. First is on Ukraine and the fact that, because the Russians invaded Ukraine, Xi Jinping and President Putin had the no limit strategic partnership just before that, it's brought international attention to the issue. You've traveled to Europe. I know I've talked to you, and you've been in conversations, discussions with other experts in Europe on the issue. I'd be interested in your sense of, are there changes in the way Europe looks at the situation with regard to Taiwan? And second, in terms of Dawei's point about the United States, some observers and the analysis of all these, different timelines, whether it's 2027 or 2035, what's your sense of what's driving this type of analysis? I saw a scholar at Stanford said that there's 100% chance that China would use military force to reunify Taiwan in the next 5 years. Where's all this coming from, in your sense, and why this type of analysis that Dawei says? What I understand, what I hear Dawei saying is it's a little bit off base, is what I hear Dawei saying.
Well, I to a certain degree, I agree with Dawei in his assessment, because I think in recent years, especially the past 2 to 3 years that we hear this narrative almost on a daily basis. China is going to invade Taiwan. China is going to invade Taiwan. And regardless of whether it is true, just that narrative has its impact, right? It first has an impact over the U.S. policy perception that if we do believe that the threat of a Chinese invasion or Chinese attack on Taiwan is imminent, then that will have a significant impact over how U.S. will plan its policy for a Taiwan contingency. And that in turn will boost U.S.-Taiwan defense ties, which in turn will be interpreted by Beijing as unilateral moves to change the status quo. But on the other hand, I also have to say that based on what we have seen, the narratives from China, this type of sense or this heightened sense of threat being received by the United States also has some of its origins based in mainland China's action and mainland China's rhetoric. You could say that those are just rhetoric and does not represent Beijing's policy. But you have to acknowledge that the Chinese media, well, assuming with the approval from the Department of Propaganda, have been talking about unification by force quite vehemently in the past several years. And every time that DPP does something in Taiwan, we hear the Chinese mainstream media, well, mainstream, quote, quote, mainstream media saying that, well, we need to be prepared. Let's be prepared militarily. So I do think that there is an interaction cycle that has made things worse between US and China on the issue of Taiwan. But I also think that the war in Ukraine, if it serves as any precedent for China, it probably will be I wouldn't say positive, but there is going to be an effect of deterrence of China's military plan against Taiwan, because it does say that the result of the war could be uncertain. That you might think that Russia was going to end the war in 1 week, but it turns out that, well, 8 months later, we're still stuck in this. And secondly, is that the cost of the war is going to be significantly higher than what you can plan for or imagine before the war starts. Look at the political, diplomatic, financial, economic, trade, just all the costs that Russia has to carry. So I would even say that the war in Ukraine has a deterrence effect over China if there is indeed a plan to attack Taiwan, which I don't think there is a timeline, because why would Beijing tie its own hand and tie a nook around its own neck and say, oh, by this date, we have to achieve unification? But in terms of Europe's position, my sense is that European countries want to support Taiwan. And morally, and from a political and diplomatic point of view, they are going to support Taiwan if there were an attack. But on the other hand, for Europe to get involved militarily, I think that's a pretty far stretch. That Europe will express its position if there's indeed a plan or indeed an operation to take over Taiwan militarily. But having that position is different from taking concrete actions to support United States or to support Taiwan in that contingency. Last but not least, I think China's position on the use of nuclear weapons during German Chancellor Scholz's visit to Beijing, I think it does play a significant role in improving Europe's position, Europe's perception on China. So I do think there are a lot of things that China can do to manipulate Europe's position down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Yunsen. All right, Ian, where does this all go? What are we headed towards greater friction in your view? And a little bit about regional perspectives that you can add.
Sure. On one, I am actually quite pessimistic, and it's not all because of what the U.S. is doing. I think, and it's not just all what the Chinese media has been saying. One of the things I really just don't understand is in the lead up to the Pelosi visit, right? Apparently, the Chinese government tried to pressure the Biden administration to then pressure Speaker Pelosi. But you know what? This is an election year. The Democrats are in a tight race. There's the executive legislative tension. When faced with this sort of pressure coming indirectly through the executive branch, why would the Speaker of the House back down? Wouldn't that just create more incentive for the Speaker of the House to demonstrate resolve? So I mean that bit is a little bit inexplicable to me. I mean, if they had wanted Pelosi to take a softer stance, delay the visit, or whatever. I mean, they could have reached out to her more directly, but this sort of approach suggests to me a sort of bluntness that might not be the best for the sort of more delicate situations that we're facing at this point in time. So that's one thing. And the other is, I mean, we've been talking a lot around Taiwan right now. I think we also have to recognize the fact that whether it's one country, two systems, so it's tied to the 92 consensus, it has no market in Taiwan. It's just tremendously unattractive. And so when, sure, Beijing will rattle the sabers and express its unhappiness, that may prevent move towards de jure independence. And certainly most Taiwanese, they want the status quo, and they want to keep it, whether they eventually want independence or unification, they want the status quo now. And I think that suggests a unattractiveness of China and the Chinese system to people in Taiwan. And if that does not get resolved, then the stalemate is here to stay, and the sort of efforts to sort of elbow around will happen, and there's going to be more potential for escalation, for accidents to happen. In terms of regional reactions, I think in Southeast Asia there was a lot of alarm. Part of it is because of perhaps a inattention to what's been going on in Taiwan. So the Pelosi visit, of course, it heightened a lot of attention to what's going, but the flights across the median line, the naval patrols, in fact, even some of the missile tests, not around Taiwan, but further in the South China, that's been happening. There's a trajectory, and it's just that before people weren't paying attention, or maybe didn't want to pay attention, but the Pelosi visit and its aftermath, the Chinese military exercises, suddenly got people in the region to realize, hey, you know what? Some of the missile test areas that China marked out, that's 20 nautical miles away from Philippine territorial waters. That's mighty close. And you know what? If there's going to be some sort of crisis, the U.S. might. I mean, traditionally, they've sort of moved forces from the Pacific to the Middle East and Central Asia via Southeast Asia, over Indonesian waters and airspace, Malaysian waters and airspace. So they will transit through Singapore. So if there's a crisis, it's going to come, the U.S. forces are likely to come the other way. Hey, you know what? The Beijing knows this, and they might try to delay these efforts, because that delay could be significant, and that would mean a lot of pressure on Southeast Asian countries. Do you open your waters? Do you open your airspace? Do you not? What kind of pressure is going to come from both Washington and Beijing? And also this effort to play on ethno-nationalism on these diverse societies that could rip these societies apart, right? And I mean, in the 20th Party Congress work report, there is a paragraph, right, where State Chairman Xi talks about United Front and talks about Hua Qiao. It's translated as Chinese nationals overseas. But even if it's just Chinese nationals overseas, it's troubling enough. But it traditionally can also be read as ethnic Chinese communities that are not Chinese nationals. That could create a lot of disruption for societies, the very diverse societies in Southeast Asia. So I think there's a recognition that a conflict in Taiwan isn't just going to be restricted to the Taiwan Strait, and I think that's worrying. But I think governments in the region don't quite have an answer for these kinds of issues just yet.
Very interesting. We've got 10 minutes left, and I've got a couple topics. There's been a lot of questions coming in on the export controls that were mentioned by a couple of you at least. And so let me just start with that. The Commerce Department obviously announced new export controls on China's semiconductor industry. The move continues the trend that we've seen in terms of, decoupling certain specialized dual-use technologies used for both commercial but also military applications. Let me start with you, Dawei. Just very simply, how are the U.S. export controls being received in Beijing, and how might China respond?
Yeah, it's being received as part of the U.S. effort try to keep China's economy down. So I think this is a very blunt explanation here. Yes, I know, just as you said, the American friends talking about dual use or human rights, this kind of thing, but it's interpreted here in Beijing by almost, I will say, majority people as just trying to slow China's economy and try to hinder the development of strategic industry. And I think those kind of ban, those kind of export control measures, of course, will create trouble for China, for China's industries. That's for sure. But I think if you do that more, I mean, if the American side do it more and more, it will create trouble for the U.S., for the American companies, and also for the third parties. I think it's challenging for the American companies if the U.S. go along this road, and if the U.S. press its alliances and partners to do that, it will create trouble, pressure for countries like Singapore and other or regions like Taiwan. I think it's the U.S. is testing its alliances. Maybe that's not in for the long run. It's not in the U.S. interest. I don't think Beijing can do anything very specific to those bans. But for those trend, for those tendency, I think China have to improve its self-reliance in technology innovation.
Ian, Dawei, talked about the U.S. effort to try to get allies and partners on board with these export controls, and who knows, maybe others in other kind of frontier technology. What's your sense on how those countries will react, including Singapore?
So I think these countries that benefit from the tight U.S. China connection obviously don't like this sort of decoupling, but I mean, it's also unclear where it's going to go, because on the one hand, sure, there's the U.S. restrictions, but there's not much you can do about it. And on the other hand, as China's talking more about being self-reliant in technology and all that, you do have to wonder going forward, what kind of market do you have, right? So I think we're coming at to a bit of a crossroads, right? In terms of how third parties try to chart their way forward, where they want to be. And this is not about necessarily supporting the US or China, but it's about what kind of options are you trying to generate for yourself in a more contentious world. That past sort of experience of globalization, everyone getting along and making money, well, I think that's gone for a while, right? And it's countries like Singapore and others in the region, I think they were trying to convince themselves that we could go back to that world. But I think now there's a slow realization that it's not happening, right? So before that talk about, oh, can't the US and China just get along and fix their problems? I think that's, to be honest, a bit of wishful thinking. The two capitals and their politics will decide where they want to go. Whatever you say as a third party doesn't matter that much. So the question is how you're going to brace yourself. They say winter is coming, right? So but there's no real clear direction right now, and I think there's some scramble and a lot of trepidation.
Thank you for that. I want to go to the last question, if I could, because we've got 5 minutes left, and I want to hear from each of you about these reports that President Biden and President Xi might meet at the G20 on the margins. There's a lot of issues that are creating friction and difficulty in the relationship. So obviously, one meeting can't resolve everything. But I'd be interested in all three of you, in your sense of how each side may be coming to this meeting. What would each side be trying to accomplish? What could the leaders do in such a meeting that would be helpful, given the current poor state of the relationship? And I'll start with Yun Sun.
Thank you, Paul. That's really a hard question. My expectation is to keep realistic expectation, because if we look at the shape and the trajectory of the U.S.-China relations and look at the midterm election that will happen to the U.S. Congress, I have very low expectation as for major positive news or major signs of improvement, because those two leaders, they personal chemistry might matter, but only when the bilateral relationship is in a good shape. To hope that one meeting between Xi and Biden is suddenly somehow going to reverse or rescue this relationship, I don't think that is realistic. But if they can get together and talk about, well, look at each other in the eye and try to talk about Taiwan and try to have some sense of the need for crisis management, and to strike some common understanding about the danger that is embedded in the bilateral relations, I would consider that a victory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ian, as Yunsun said, these two leaders have a history. They spent a lot of time together when they were both vice presidents. But the last time they've seen each other was back in 2015. So it's been 7+ years. What's your sense on what advice would you have? What can be accomplished in such a meeting?
They did have a very long video conference, but I think despite them having some history, President Biden has said that she's not his friend. So while they have some history, I think there is there's still some distance between the two of them. I'm going to be a little bit more pessimistic than Sun Yun, and say that I'm not sure whether chemistry all that will work, but the bare minimum is if the two sides at least have a gauge of each other such that there may be a reduction, not a removal, a reduction of the probability of miscalculation. I take that as a win, right? Because as Dawei had mentioned earlier, right, the two sides have not had the COVID period. There's a lot of mutual suspicion, degree of animosity driven by rhetoric from the U.S. side, and as Sun Yun also mentioned, rhetoric from the Chinese side. So there's, I think, a lot of potential for misunderstanding and miscalculation. So I'm not even going with agreement, right? If they sort of figure out, okay, these are some of the areas we want to be more careful about, we want to be more cautious, so we at least avoid some sorts of unintended escalation. I think that's a plus.
Yeah. I remember you're talking about the lack of contact. I remember in the Bush administration, we had over 100 official dialogues with the Chinese side, over 100. And today, I don't know if we have one, really. I'm not sure we have one official dialogue that's ongoing. So I'm a supporter of them at least meeting, right, and having the opportunity. Dawei, going to give you the last word, but my first question is going to be, in your view, are they going to meet? We haven't heard an announcement that they're going to meet, but if they do meet, which I hope they do, what's your sense of what could be accomplished, if anything?
I don't have any inside news. I only heard rumors, but my hunch is I think they are. It's very likely that they will meet. I think it's there is a quite high probability, and if they do meet, I hope, just as I agree with all three of you. I think if this meeting can pave a way for more regular senior official dialogues between the two sides, I think that's a victory. And if the two sides can announce that they change some the 8 points, 8 sanctions. Some of the China may announce lift some sanctions after the August visit. Those, for instance, dialogue over climate change. I think that will be a victory. And if we can agree to resume more or to have more flights between the two countries to work towards that direction, I think that will be a victory. Anyway, I think my expectation is low, but I hope it can pave a way for more communications next year.
Dawei, it's a terrific way to end our discussion. It's the top of the hour. We've come up on our time. Been a terrific discussion. We've covered quite a bit. And I want to thank each of you, Dawei, Ian Chong, Yunsun, and of course, thank you for our audience for tuning in. As a reminder, our discussion will be posted online on the China in the World podcast site, where you can listen to it again if you want to hear it twice, or if you missed some of it as well. And so thank you again to everyone for joining. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for having me.